I am super into storytelling. I've got a lot to say about it. I think it's very important to connect all of us. And, actually, my very first open source project I maintained 5 years ago, almost to the day because it was for Hacktoberfest. And I learned a lot through that experience. I learned about being able to work with other contributors. I learned about creating good, solid issues. I learned about the challenges that maintainers have. But like even in the last year and a half, I've been working at OpenSauced. I've been talking to a lot of open source maintainers, and I feel looking at some of the chat. Thank you all. I feel that like we all have our own story to tell and we all have challenges we face, but I don't think that these are insurmountable challenges. I think that these are things that we can face together. Whether or not you're a contributor or you're a maintainer or you use open source software, like all of these things pertain to you. Like it's very important that we recognize that we are all invested in open source software, whether or not we know it. You don't have to be a maintainer, you don't have to be a contributor, but I can guarantee that you are a user of open source software. So this is what I'm going to be talking about today. And so let's just like take it back a little bit and think about open source when it started. So when it started, it was more of like a hobbyist project. There were a bunch of people that want to be able to share information together. And I think that we're not so distant from that past. Like we can understand that we want to share and innovate. And I think that, there are many different reasons why people get into tech. But I think that one of the main reasons is because people are so excited for what they experience because we're moving at such a fast pace and it never stops, right? Like tech continues to keep moving forward and we get excited by these new things. Sure, it can get really exhausting, but we want to keep up. We want to know what the newest trends are. We want to innovate. We want to push. And this is one of the reasons why I feel like if we look at Facebook, for an example, or Meta, they've open sourced a lot of their AI offerings. Why? Because they want people to be able to use those things. They want adoption and they want to see it push forward. When we open source things, we often get feedback about those things, which can be ultimately good, but we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So many of the maintainers that I've talked to in the last year have said, you know what? I found that I had a problem and I needed to solve it. So I did. And then it grew into this open source project that I never anticipated. And so what really happened was they solved the problem and things grew and things changed. Now, I don't know how many people have read Working in Public, the Making and Maintenance of Open Source Software. Let me grab it. It's like right here on my desk. Try not to like smash anything. Okay, so let me see if this is on my camera. Okay, so the book looks like this. Sorry, there's like really hard to, but anyway, you get the general gist of things. That is an ultimately, OSS is open source software. Um, and that book is a really great detailed account of a lot of the challenges that maintainers face. And this is something that like we need to be aware of. But one of the things I want to talk about, I'm going to extend. So Nadia Egbal writes that book and she talks about this reference to Christmas lights. Okay, so essentially, like let's think of open source like this. I don't know how many of you put up Christmas lights, but let's say Christmas season is coming closer and we are putting up Christmas lights in our house. Like I love putting up Christmas lights. I put them up for I don't even know how long, but I love it. It's great. It's beautiful. It like creates this magical sparkle, right? And people will drive by and look at Christmas lights and that just like feels nice, right? But like what if your neighbor comes over and they're like, "Hey, your Christmas lights are good, but they would be a little bit better if you just like put up this Santa Claus display. Can you put up the Santa Claus display?" And you're like, "Okay, I will put up the Santa Claus display." And so then the next day, you get up in the morning and you start putting up the Santa Claus display, right? And then you find that the Santa Claus display, the lights are all like super tangled up. And so then you have to untangle all of these Christmas lights so you can get this working. But halfway through untangling all the lights, you realize that like you just spent half of your entire day untangling these lights, but like you got a day job. And so the last 4 hours that you've spent, you haven't gotten paid for, and now you need to make up for that somewhere else. And so you're like, hey, I got to put a pause on this. I'm going to go take care of my day job because I'm not getting paid to put up these Christmas lights, right? And so then you go and you're doing your day job, and then like somebody knocks at your door and they're like, hey, like you're not done with this thing. Can you like finish it? Because it's making my house look bad across the street. And you're like, I really have to work this day job to be able to pay for the electricity that powers my Christmas lights. So I can't get to it right now. So they're like, do you mind if I work on it? And you're like, sure, go for it. And so you let them work on it. You do your day job, and then you come back and you find out that they've made more of a disaster than when you even started. And so not only do you have these tangled Santa Claus Christmas lights, but now they've taken your original Christmas lights and they tangled them up into the Santa Claus display. And so you're like, what is going to happen now? Like, who is going to take care of this? And the neighbor who initially said that they would untangle your Christmas lights and put up the Santa Claus display is like, actually, I don't have time for that. So thanks, but no thanks. I'm not going to do it. So now you have completed 8 hours of work, 4 hours later than you anticipated. So it's like 10 p.m. at night, and you're trying to untangle these Christmas lights, get it back to the original state. And then one of your neighbors comes over from the right hand side of your house, and they're like, hey, all of my lights are white lights. And you have colored lights. And so it's like really not like keeping up with the vibe of what I want for my Christmas lights. So can you change your colored lights to white lights? And you're just like, all I wanted to do was like put up Christmas lights. I like Christmas lights. They make me happy. They make my kids happy. They make people that drive by happy. Like, I don't really know what to do. And so you're like, I'll think about it, right? Like, that's just like kind of like what you say if you want people to continue to consider this. And so then you have your other neighbor on the left side, and they come over and they're like, hey, I really want colored Christmas lights. And you're like, well, yes, my lights are colored. And they're like, if you change them to white, it's going to mess with my vibe. So then you're stuck in this argument between two sets of people, and you have to figure out what is going on, right? Like, what decisions do I make? Initially, I made this project for myself to solve a problem, and now I'm getting demands from all over. And this is certainly not what I anticipated. In the same way that this tweet is putting out there, like it's a challenge to create an open source project when you love it, like you work with your friends, you get on the same energy path, and then suddenly you have all of these external points where people are just making these demands, and they're making it really challenging to continue to do what you want to do. And like ultimately, that's what open source is kind of about. And so when we look at all of the challenges of open source, we think about like maintainers are faced with this overwork and constant demands, right? It's not just Christmas lights, right? Like this is the extended metaphor of things. People are making demands, and a lot of times they don't do it really nicely. Like I've talked to maintainers who have showed me what people have said in the comments. Number one, if you're one of those people that is swearing at maintainers, like you're doing that in public, okay? So nobody should hire you or work with you based on your work in public, because that's not okay. People are putting this out there, and generally, most people are not paying for that. On top of that, there's a lack of recognition and support for maintainers. So what's happening is maintainers are finding themselves in this situation where they're doing tons of work and nobody cares, right? Like nobody's saying like, thank you for doing this thing, or like, I appreciate you. You've solved a problem for me. Um, And there's an emotional labor of community management. So I've spent many years as a community manager as well. And one of the things that I found is that communities generally don't agree at all. And so there's always like, there's disagreement, and I'm totally okay with disagreement. I don't feel that it's bad. I think that it pushes all of us forward and that we're able to grow and learn from each other in those spaces. But if you're a maintainer that has not signed up to manage a community, you have to understand that this is additional labor that's put onto maintainers that they have not signed up for. Yes, developers do have lots of opinions. We are all not shocked by that situation. But who's in charge of navigating those opinions? Who's in charge of being the decision maker? Oftentimes, that's maintainers, again, who have not signed up for that. They were solving a problem for themselves. They did not anticipate being in the middle of navigating this argument, right? And so there's a lot of emotional labor and community management. And like as a result of all that, there's also isolation and loneliness. So if you've ever managed a community, if you've ever been a maintainer, you might find that you are kind of like a step away from the rest of the community. You can't say to the whole community, like, wow, this person is like really getting on my nerves and I don't know what to do about that. Because now you're in a leadership position and you have to navigate those situations. And so you're a step outside of the community. And so you have to figure out, like, okay, now how do I navigate this? Who am I able to talk to? And really, there's not a really clear way to identify, like, who are the maintainers out there that I can talk to. So it becomes very, very challenging to be able to have that communication with other people and to know, like, what do I do next? There's this thing called the Lozado ratio, which maybe you've heard of, but it's also called the magic ratio, which suggests that it takes 3 to 5 positive comments to undo one negative comment in a personal or professional setting. So when we find that somebody says all of these negative things in an open source project, how do we navigate that space? Like, how do we feel okay to move forward as maintainers? And so what we end up finding is like burnout happens on top of burnout. And so here on the screen, you can see there's this post from Lee Robinson, who is VP of product, I think, at Vercel. And I thought like this was a really great demonstration of what burnout looks like. Because it's not just people disagreeing about the code or the approach that you're taking, but sometimes it gets really personal. And like, number one, why? Why are we getting really personal with all of these things, right? You don't have to personally attack the maintainers or people that are contributing because that doesn't move us forward. And if we go back to the roots of open source, we know that the core of open source is to share and innovate and move forward, right? So if you are negatively commenting on people personally, this is against the spirit of open source. And like, just stop doing that. But also, let's recognize that sometimes maintainers are facing that. It doesn't even happen in public. So if people have a social presence online, or if they're in a Discord, sometimes you get DMs about things, about like, why didn't you do this? Why haven't you checked my PR yet? All of these things can be intensely stressful on open source maintainers. And you have to think, like, if you are putting that message out there, you're not the only person that's putting that negative message out there. So, number one, take a breather, step back, don't do it. And then figure out how you can positively contribute to the conversation. We don't want to pile things on top of maintainers and have these ridiculously high expectations for them when we know that this is a problem. Because what happens is maintainers eventually step back. They stop, they move backwards, they don't respond. And if you're lucky, maybe they find someone to replace them, but that's not always the case. A lot of times maintainers leave a project because of how the contributors behave. So we have to think about that. We also have to think about like the value that maintainers bring. What happens when maintainers leave a project because they can't maintain it anymore? This is one example that I found in the last year and a half that I was just like kind of mind boggling, right? So there's this package that is pretty widely used. It's a critical tool in the Node.js ecosystem. So in May of 2022, so that's like more than 2 years ago, right? Dane Springmeyer says he was going to step down as maintainer. So he gave this pretty detailed issue about what he thought it would take to onboard a new maintainer to make this a good experience for a new maintainer and what that would look like, right? And here's the catch here. This was not resolved until June of 2024. So 2 years later, a new maintainership plan was implemented. So, what does that even mean? Like, this project pretty much sat stagnant for 2 years, and this was a really important project in the Node.js ecosystem. So, mm, let me, here we go. Next slide. So, this is a challenge. This becomes the invisible maintainer. So, in essence, that project had no maintainer at all, right? And so, who was making the decisions for that project? Well, the answer is nobody was making the decisions of that. The other issue of having invisible maintainers is that you have projects, but you're not really sure who the maintainers are. So you don't know where to direct questions. You don't know who is making decisions about the project. And when there's a lack of transparency, we find that there's not clear communications and roles and responsibilities either. So there might be people out there that are willing to step up, they're willing to do the work, but they don't know how to do the work, right? And so then it becomes a challenge for everybody who is using that package. Um, in addition to that, like if you don't, in a recent podcast interview, Jordan Harband asked, "How many humans can screw up my dependency graph?" And he didn't necessarily mean it in terms of the way that I'm talking now, but that thought, that sentiment really got me thinking about like what we're talking about here today. The answer is one. It only takes one person to screw up your dependency graph, right? And so if you don't know who the maintainers are of the projects that you depend on, if you don't know who to communicate with when you are trying to implement a fix for an open source project, your project might be in trouble. There might be a challenge. And so what we find is when this happens, projects are at risk of stagnation. There might be unresolved issues that start to pile up. There might be projects that are left in limbo. Maybe security patches are delayed. Community confusion and frustration continue to happen. Sorry, just checking some of the comments there. So when a maintainer walks away, the important thing to recognize is that the project doesn't stop. Unresolved issues start to pile up. We see that pull requests are often left unreviewed, and this means that security patches are delayed. There's confusion and frustration. People don't know what's going to happen next, and this is a real challenge for those projects, right? Um, this is not what we want from the open source projects that we depend on, but it's like very important to recognize that most of us don't know when this happens. It would be really, really useful for you right now to look at all of your dependencies and to ask yourself, do I know the maintainers? Do I know that all the maintainers of these dependencies have updated their security vulnerabilities? Do I know that all of them are protecting me from any source of vulnerability? I can say that the majority of us here don't know the answers to those questions. And this is not an accusation against anybody. This is just like the typical way that we've done things in open source, and it really needs to change to continue to keep all of us safe. One of the big things that we don't realize with open source usage is that when a maintainer leaves, we also have knowledge debt. And what does that mean? That means that we can lose project history, we can lose context. We don't know why design decisions were made. We don't know what the roadmap looks like. This stuff can all be probably resolved if a new maintainer comes on, but it doesn't mean that it can be resolved immediately. If you have a gap, like we saw with Dane Springmeyer, where it's 2 years, how much stuff has accumulated that now needs to be resolved? How many new decisions need to be made? Now, I talked about a project at the beginning of this talk where I maintained my first open source project. In that project, I was pretty new to React Native, and the project was a postpartum wellness app. And the reason why I decided to do this project is because I went into the App Store and I was postpartum with my fourth kid. And I wanted something to help me with like my mental health and the health of my baby. And the majority of the apps in the App Store were about losing weight. I was like, well, that's a no-go for me. That's not the healthy path that I want to achieve. So I want to be able to do this. So I was doing something like very outside of my comfort zone. But this was a project that I was doing to solve my need in the free time that I have. And like I said, I have 4 kids, so there's not that much free time that's happening here. And so there have been periods of that project that just went stagnant, right? And I remember one year I had to decide, like, okay, do I start this project from scratch or do I update all of these dependencies that haven't been touched for a year? Ultimately, it was much easier for me to to start the project new than it was to update all of the dependencies and to understand, like, okay, what doesn't work with this other package that I didn't touch in the last year, right? And so all of that stuff is like knowledge work that a maintainer has to constantly do to keep the project safe and up to date. Okay, so there's all this ongoing learning and documentation, and like we have AI and all of these tools now that people are saying like can solve so many problems. But ultimately, right now, there's nothing that solves knowledge debt and AI. We don't know why maintainers made the decisions they do. They did. And you can look back in PR reviews, you can look back in issue comments, and that can give you more context, which is incredibly important to understanding that knowledge debt. But that takes time. So if you have a gap in maintainers, there's going to be a huge amount of time for somebody to get up to speed and make the right decisions for the project. And so, as part of this, I think that we need to think about the ecosystem impact that it makes. So we know that dependent projects will face instability when they're not updated. We know that users lose trust in software when they're not being updated. You might not even know this about your project, but when you discover it, I guarantee that you'll understand that you've lost some trust there because it's probably not safe if it's been left stagnant. There's also potential for widespread disruptions, and like we can see this in like the blue screen of death that we saw last year when things hit our airport systems, right? Like when something is finally updated, when things are not working, then that's usually when we start to notice, like, oh, this hasn't been maintained properly, right? But, like, where were you the past year when these things weren't being maintained properly? This is something that we all need to invest in and understand. This is what everything that we do every day depends on. And so the open source ecosystem health is at risk. We need to recognize that it's at risk. And this is all part of the software bill of materials. It's also known as SBOM. And this, the software bill of materials is like, what is your project dependent on? Are those projects safe? Do they have good maintainers? Are they well maintained? These are little things that we can start doing to keep our project safe against these vulnerabilities. And so this is where I think that we need to start assessing open source health. We need to rethink these project metrics because a lot of times we're like, yeah, we've got 50,000 stars. This is an amazing project. But like maybe 50,000 stars are not the markers that we really want to be looking at. We want to be looking at metrics that really matter. And so some of the things that we can look at are, contributors. Are people contributing to these projects or are they just starring them? Starring is a marketing metric, and like even to some extent forking can be a marketing metric. But who is actually helping to sustain these projects? That's what contributor confidence helps us to understand. And we don't just want internal contributors. We want people who are external. We want people who are recurring. They come back to make sure this project works. And the last thing that I'm going to mention here is the lottery factor. So you may have heard this being talked about as the bus factor. We just like to put a positive spin on it at OpenSauced. This means that 50%, if your lottery factor is high, 50% or more contributions are coming from two or fewer people. You don't want that because if one of those people decides that they are burnt out, they're exhausted, or if they've won the lottery and they're going to move on and own their llama farm in Peru or whatever, they're not going to maintain your project. And then suddenly this project is unstable because nobody is invested in it, right? So we have to really understand what's happening with our projects. And we have to understand we can track this stuff with marketing metrics if we take the time to do that. So I mentioned SBOM really quickly, and so this is just an example of what SBOM looks like. These are different projects that Microsoft TypeScript depends on, and so this like goes along with Josh Goldberg's talk a little bit, where we look at all of these dependencies, keep TypeScript going. So what does that look like? What is the lottery factor for those? How are maintainers supported in those projects? And the OSF score that you see there on the end of that graph, that is the safety score, right? Like this is the security score for the project. So is it okay that some of that project has a 4.5 or a 4.8 score? That's going to be up to you to decide, like, am I okay with depending on a project that depends on a project that has a 4.5 safety score? But at the very least, you can't say that you didn't know that there may be some potential security vulnerabilities here. These are all things that we need to be looking at and we need to be thinking at for our projects. And so what does this mean in terms of making a sustainable open source? Like, well, first of all, I think that, we talk a lot about sustainability in open source. And I think that the models are out there. Like we have answers to the problems of sustainability in open source. Financial support through sponsorships gives us the opportunity to directly fund projects that we depend upon. But still, many maintainers are underfunded. And this is not something that you or I specifically can deal with, right? Like I can give money to a project, you can give money to a project, but ultimately, if our company is depending on a project, that corporate responsibility comes key to solving this problem. So we have to encourage our companies to be willing to donate money to support the maintainers of the projects that we depend upon. There's also sustainable licensing. Like I've seen a lot of companies in the last year change their licensing. And for some of them, it's been a lot of really negative publicity. And I'm not going to necessarily talk about that. I think there's a right way and maybe a wrong way or a different way to communicate things. But you have to be able to communicate to your users. Ultimately, at the end of the day, if a company cannot sustain itself because the costs are too high, then we have to find a way for them to be able to sustain themselves. And licensing can be a way to do that. Sure, that might mean that it's no longer, by definition, open source. But I think that if we look at the ultimate overall impact, that being able to pay and fund these projects is going to be really key to making a sustainable future. And the last part of that is community engagement. And like we're in Hacktoberfest right now. We've got 7 days left of Hacktoberfest. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is like, hey, let's contribute to these projects. Let's get PRs in. And then we drop off after the month of October. But ideally, what really helps maintainers is when you continually and you sustainably continue to contribute to their projects. They don't need one-off contributions most of the time. What they need is people who are willing to invest their time and effort and to show up when they need them. And so all of these things come together to make a sustainable open source. So what I want to say to you right now is that all of us use open source every single day, whether we know it or not. 96% of software runs on open source at some point or another. So we are part of the solution. Whether you are donating, whether you are contributing, whether you are encouraging your company to give back to the open source projects that you maintain, you are responsible for the sustainability of open source. So today I am encouraging you to leave this talk and to go figure out what is your role. What is the investment that you are going to do to make sure that open source has a sustainable future? So thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If you want to connect with me, I am Bekah HW on all socials.
Very cool
Bekah, that was fabulous. Real quick, can you hold your book up again?
Yes, sorry. So it is the making and maintenance of, working in public, the making and maintenance of open source software. It's just like, let me try and put it.
All right, cool. There were questions that we're asking about that, and maybe we can get it later.
Nadia Egbal. So Nadia, and then it's Eghbal.
And if you have a question about that or about Bekah's forthcoming young adult book, you can find Bekah. She's probably everywhere and easy to find. She'd be happy to tell you about this. Wonderful talk. I thought the Christmas light analogy was hilarious. And about the bus factor being a pretty, kind of morbid way to put it, it actually came out of the Python community. What would Python do if Guido got hit by a bus? I realized nobody ever asked Guido about this analogy, and maybe llamas in Peru really were the thing that he wanted to talk about. And we did a poll. How do you support open source maintainers? 244 votes in the chat. I don't was the winner. And money was 9%. So,
but I think, the thing there is just advocate for open source projects that you're using at your company, and if you are managing a team, especially to say, we depend on this project, the lottery factor is very high. We want to continue to work on this project. And, the lottery factor is not necessarily negative, but research clearly shows that if a maintainer is supported financially, they are more likely to address bugs and security vulnerabilities than if they were not. So just keep that in mind.
And thank you, all of you at OpenSauced, for what you're doing on all of this. Colin, over to you for some questions.
Yeah, in relation to that kind of supporting open source maintainers, looking at it from an open source maintainer's perspective, only recently have they gotten the tools to accept financial support. What are some of the things an open source maintainer should do to be ready to accept kind of the financial support from organizations and other developers to help maintain their software?
Yeah, so I can speak personally, but for the community I run, we set up an LLC and we accepted donations or sponsorships through GitHub sponsors. But there are other, you can do Open Collective, and now Sentry has their OSS pledge, which is like super great to the OSS pledge says it's essentially focused on providing monetary support for open source maintainers. And so they want companies to devote certain amount of money based on the number of employees that they have to be able to financially support the maintainers of the packages that they use. And I think that, that's been a really great wake-up call for a lot of people. But I would say having something, it might be Patreon, it might be GitHub sponsors, Open Collective. There's one more, Hero Devs, maybe. I'm like, there's like one more that just I feel like popped up in the last year that has been really, really good and doesn't take money away from the maintainers. But these make it clear pathways. Put that in your README. Put that on your org on GitHub. All of these things can create a clear path for people. And I also think, like, don't be afraid to ask people, like, hey, I'm having a really hard month. I can't maintain this if I don't have your support. This is how I need it.
Mhm. Yep, that's great advice. Mahmoud asks, and I've seen this actually a lot in chat. A lot of people want to help open source maintainers. They've always wanted to, but just never knew how to get started. So we had asked a couple people about ways to do in the poll, but like, what are your recommended ways that people should get involved with open source projects? What's a good way to dip your toes in helping maintainers?
So we have a course at OpenSauced. You can find it at opensauced.pizza/intro. And it gives you it walks you through what it's like to contribute to open source. But I would say it depends on where you are in your journey. So if you're very new, there's plenty of ways to do it in a non-code way. So if you're nervous about submitting code, one of the biggest challenges maintainers face is with people knowing about their project. So I get a lot of questions about, like, oh, like, I'm doing this project, but nobody knows about it, so I don't get contributors. Write a blog post about it. Talk about it with your friends. Put it on social media. Like, that's a great way to get started. Answer questions. One of the biggest challenges, like, we get the same questions over and over, even though it's in documentation. Answer those questions for people. Like, that
Hmm.
takes a huge burden off of maintainers. If you want to contribute code, look at the projects that you depend on and see where their issues are open. But, like, first of all, live in those communities. Understand what the mission is of that project. I listened to a podcast with Evan Yu recently where he was talking about his project, and they were asking about, like, okay, so how do you know if someone's ready to be a core member or something like that? He said, if that person understands what the project is about and the approach and the philosophy we're taking, then I know that that person is ready to contribute. And so for him, like, there was one contributor in particular that just kept showing up, creating these PRs, and it showed, like, this person clearly understands what we're talking about. So, like, devote yourself to a project, like, get interested in one thing and go for it. And you'll find that, like, not only will you support that project, but you'll create a really strong network of people that are willing to support you in that project and beyond.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. I know a lot of people, even in chat today, were mentioning like maybe sometimes their job keeps them from contributing to open source or potentially like helping open source maintainers. Sometimes your world can feel very small, and getting involved with communities can really open things up for you. So I think that's great advice, Becca. Excellent advice. Paul, do you have
Thanks. I
any
just want to
other? Yeah, go ahead, Becca.
Mind if I
Sorry.
jump in real quick? Because I
Yeah.
gave the wrong link. We, like, changed the subdirectory. So it is opensauce.pizza/learn, because we now have two courses, which is the intro to open source course and the becoming a maintainer course. So if you're looking for that, if you're looking for the courses we have, it's at opensauce.pizza/learn.
Yeah.
I sent
Thank
them
you.
to your blog post
Yeah.
because it looks good and it has a nice picture of a pizza on it. So I'm like, there you go. That's all
Thank you.
yours.
I love pizza.
You know, speaking of open source maintainers, we actually have an open source maintainer here, Jerome Dev. They say lack of recognition is definitely what's hurting him right now, maintaining an 80K stars project and most interactions is about what's wrong. So like that negativity you had mentioned about mental health, your personal mental health, the mental health of maintainers. Do you have any tips or advice for folks who are maybe struggling with the overwhelming negativity of like having a popular project?
Yeah, so Jerome, I'd love it if you contact me if we have a chat one-on-one, because I know that this is a real challenge for people. And that tweet that I showed from Lee from Vercel, I think, like, kind of breaks things down in terms of, like, sometimes you have to take a step back, or you have to be able to think about things, or just say, maybe you need somebody like kind of like a bulldog. I don't know the right term here, to be the person that comes in and says, like, that's not an appropriate way to talk to us. So, like, if you want to come back and give this information to us in a different way, then come back. But right now, I'm closing this issue because this is not how we do things here. And like, I think that having that support of somebody that's willing to do that can be really useful, because then you don't have to navigate that. But like, as humans, like, I think that it's also okay for you to say, like, this hurts really bad and I need a break from it, because we're not robots, right? Like, we can't just filter this stuff out. It's not like a fish tank, right? Like, the bad doesn't go in the filter and then goes. It just like kind of sticks in our brains, and that's just like neurologically how we're built. So, it is definitely a challenge, and I think that sometimes there are strategies that we can put in place to decrease those things. But like, I just also want to say, like, I'm very sorry that you're dealing with that. Is very hard, and I'm happy to hear more about like what specifically you're going through, to see if I can help.
I really appreciate this talk, everything that you're doing, everything OpenSauced is doing. I encourage everyone who's got questions in the chat, but on both sides. I am a consumer. I want to help. I'm a provider. I need help. Find Bekah, get in contact. Let's all make things better. Thanks a lot, Bekah.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.